Go ahead, I told the attorney, my voice steady as I signed the document, start the seizure process. He hesitated for half a second, just enough to look at me over the rim of his glasses like he was trying to decide if I really understood what I was doing. Then he nodded and slid the papers back into the folder, the sound of the clasp clicking shut echoing louder than it should have in that quiet office, and across the glass wall behind him I could see my parents standing in the hallway. My mother's arms folded tight across her chest, my father pacing like he always did when something slipped out of his control, and neither of them knew that in less than 48 hours, everything they thought they had gained from me would start unraveling piece by piece, because what they took wasn't the full story, it was just the part one let them see. And what they didn't know, what they never even thought to ask, was that the $250,000 house they sold out from under me was the smallest asset I owned. 5 years ago, if you had asked anyone in my family who I was, they would have described me the same way every time: practical, quiet, dependable, the kind of daughter who didn't cause problems, the kind who handled things on her own. My younger sister, Olivia, she was the opposite, outgoing, charismatic, the one my parents called special, the one who got the attention, the opportunities, the celebration dinners. And I got used to it early, the way my mother would say things like, "You're the strong one, Emily, you don't need as much," like strength was just another word for being overlooked, and I believed her for a long time. I believed that if I worked harder, stayed quieter, didn't ask for anything, eventually it would balance out, but it never did, it just made it easier for them to take more. I remember one dinner in particular, a few months after I closed on my house, a small place just outside the city, nothing flashy, but it was mine. I had saved for years, worked double shifts, skipped vacations, tracked every dollar, and when I finally got the keys, I stood in the empty living room with the lights off just to hear how quiet it was, how it felt like something I had built on my own. And that night at dinner, Olivia was talking about a trip to Napa my parents had just paid for, laughing about the vineyard tours, the private tastings, and my dad raised his glass and said, "We're investing in experiences for her, things that matter." Then he looked at me and added, almost like an afterthought, "You already have your house, Em, you're set," and everyone nodded like that made sense. Like stability was the same thing as being done, and I smiled because that's what I always did. I smiled and said, "Yeah, I'm good," even though something about the way he said it stuck with me, like a line had been drawn and I was on the side that didn't get anything more. It started small after that, little comments, little asks, my mom mentioning bills, my dad talking about market downturns, Olivia's expenses getting higher, always framed as temporary, always with that same phrase, family helps family, and I did help. At first it was a few hundred here, a couple thousand there, nothing that hurt me, nothing that felt like too much. Until one evening my father called me into the living room and spread out a set of documents on the coffee table, the kind of setup that made it feel official before he even said a word, and he leaned back in his chair and said, "We've been thinking about a way to stabilize things long term," and my mother nodded beside him, her voice softer but more calculated. "It would just be a temporary transfer, Emily, putting the house under our name for a bit would give us leverage with the bank," and I remember the exact way my stomach tightened when she said it, because something about it didn't feel right, not wrong enough to call it out, but not clean enough to ignore. And I asked, "Why my house?" And my dad didn't miss a beat. "Because it's paid off, because it's the safest option, because we trust you." And that word, trust, it landed heavier than it should have, because in our family, trust had always meant compliance, it meant not asking too many questions. And I sat there looking at the papers, at the neat rows of text, the signature lines waiting at the bottom, and I told myself it was temporary. I told myself they wouldn't risk our relationship over something like this. I told myself a lot of things that made it easier to pick up the pen. The transfer went through in less than 2 weeks, the process smoother than I expected, which should have been another warning sign, but I ignored that too, because nothing changed right away. I still had access to the house, I still had my keys, my things were still where I left them, and for a while it felt like maybe I had overreacted, maybe it really was just paperwork, just a technical move to help the family. And then 10 days later, I left town for a work trip, 3 days in Chicago. Meetings back to back, barely enough time to think about anything else, and on the second morning, while I was sitting in a conference room half listening to a presentation, my phone buzzed with a notification I almost ignored, a message from a number I didn't recognize. "Hi, this is Mark, we just closed on the property, wanted to coordinate move-in timing," and for a second, I thought it was a mistake, wrong number, wrong person. But then he sent the address, my address, and everything around me went quiet in that way it does when your brain is trying to catch up to something your body already understands, and I stepped out of the room, called the number back, my hand already starting to shake, and when he answered, cheerful, casual, like this was just another normal transaction, he said, "Yeah, we finalized yesterday, your parents handled everything, we're planning to move in this weekend." And I remember pressing my free hand against the wall just to stay upright, asking the same question 3 different ways because none of the answers made sense, until finally he said, slower this time, like he thought maybe I didn't understand how real estate worked. They're the owners, they had the right to sell. And that was the moment something inside me didn't break, it didn't shatter, it just went still, like a switch flipping off, because I realized 2 things at the exact same time. The first was that they had never intended to give it back, and the second was that they had no idea what they had actually started. The first thing I did after that call was not cry, not panic, not even call my parents. I just stood there in that hallway outside the conference room staring at my reflection in the glass like I was looking at someone else's life unfolding in front of me, and I remember thinking, this is not a mistake, this is a decision, they planned this, they timed it, they waited until I was out of town so I would not be able to stop it, and once that thought settled in, everything else became very clear. So I walked back into the conference room, sat down, and finished the meeting like nothing had happened, because I had learned a long time ago that reacting too early only gives people more control over you, and I was done giving them that. I waited until the end of the day to call my father, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to hear exactly how he would explain it when he thought he still had the upper hand, and when he answered, his voice was calm, almost relieved, like he had been expecting the call. "Emily," he said, "I figured you would find out today," and that one sentence told me everything. There was no apology, no hesitation, just confirmation, and I asked him, as evenly as I could, "You sold my house, and—" He corrected me immediately, "Our house, Emily, it was in our name," and I could hear my mother in the background, not speaking, just close enough to listen, and I said, "You told me it was temporary," and there was a pause, not long, just enough for him to choose his words. "It was what we needed at the time," he said, "and now we need the liquidity," like this was a business decision, like I was a line item on a spreadsheet. And something in me almost admired the consistency, because this was who they had always been. I had just finally stopped pretending otherwise. I asked him one more question, the only one that mattered: "Did you ever plan to give it back?" And this time the pause was longer, heavier, and when he spoke again, his voice had that familiar edge, the one he used when he wanted to shut a conversation down. "You are overthinking this, Emily, you are still young, you will recover, this is what families do for each other," and I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable, the same script, the same justification, the same expectation that I would absorb the loss quietly and move on, and I realized in that moment that they had already written the ending in their heads. I would struggle, I would rebuild, and they would never face any consequences for what they did. "Okay," I said, and my voice surprised even me because it was completely steady. "Then we are done," and before he could respond, I ended the call. And for a few seconds I just stood there with the phone still in my hand, feeling that same stillness settle over me again, not emptiness, not even anger, just clarity. I did not call my mother, I did not call Olivia, I did not send a message or ask for explanations, because explanations are only useful when someone is trying to fix something, and they were not, they had already moved on, so I did the same, just in a very different direction. That night, instead of going back to my hotel room, I opened my laptop in the lobby and pulled up every document I had saved over the past 5 years, every purchase agreement, every wire confirmation, every property record, things I had kept organized out of habit, not because I thought I would ever need them like this, and as I scrolled through them, I could feel something shift, not in the situation, but in how I was looking at it, because for the first time, I was not seeing what I had lost. I was seeing what I still had, and more importantly, what they did not know existed. There was a reason I had never talked about my other investments, not to them, not to anyone in my family, because every time I had shared something in the past, it had been minimized, redirected, or quietly absorbed into their expectations, so I learned to keep certain things separate, to build without announcing it, to move without asking for approval, and over time, that had turned into something much bigger than I think even I fully appreciated until that night. I pulled up the map first, the cluster of properties just outside the city, the ones I had started acquiring one by one over the past 3 years, small at first, then larger, always in the same area, always with the same long-term plan in mind, and right in the middle of that cluster, highlighted in a different color, was the house they had just sold, the one they thought was the center of everything, and I zoomed out slowly, watching how small it looked compared to everything around it, how insignificant it was in the larger picture, and I remember leaning back in my chair and thinking, they really believed that was all I had. Around midnight, I made the second call of the day, this one very different from the first, and when the attorney answered, his tone was professional but curious, like he was not expecting to hear from me at that hour. "This is Emily Carter," I said. "I need to review a property transfer that was executed without my consent," and there was a brief pause as he processed that. "Do you have documentation?" he asked. And I looked down at the stack of files open in front of me, every page exactly where it needed to be. "Yes," I said, "and I think you are going to find it very interesting." And as I said it, I realized something I had not felt all day, not loss, not betrayal, but something much colder and much more precise: control. By the next morning, everything was already in motion, not visibly, not in a way anyone outside could notice, but in the quiet, structured way that real consequences begin. I met the attorney in his office at 9 sharp, the same office I would later return to with a very different purpose, and he went through the documents slowly, page by page, not rushing, not reacting, just absorbing, asking precise questions in a tone that stayed neutral no matter what he was seeing. "When exactly was the transfer executed? Were you present for the signing? Did you receive any proceeds from the sale?" And I answered each one clearly, no hesitation, no emotion, because this was no longer about what they did to me. It was about what could be proven. And when he finally leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers the way people do when they have reached a conclusion they are confident in, he said something that most people would have found alarming, but to me sounded like confirmation. "There are multiple issues here," and then after a brief pause, "significant ones." He explained it carefully, not dramatizing, just laying out the structure. The transfer they convinced me to sign had conditions attached that were not clearly disclosed, language buried in sections most people would not think to question, and more importantly, the timing of the sale, the way it was executed while I was out of state, raised questions about intent and authorization, not enough to undo everything instantly, but more than enough to challenge it, to slow it down, to pull it apart piece by piece. And as he spoke, I could see the path forming, not fast, not simple, but real, and that was all I needed. "What do you want to do?" he asked, and I did not answer right away, not because I was unsure, but because I was choosing how far I was willing to take it, because once this started, it would not just be about the house, it would be about everything connected to it, every transaction, every decision, every assumption they had made about what I would or would not do. And I thought about that dinner table, about the way they had looked at me like I was already finished, like I had reached my limit, and I realized something very simple: they had never actually seen me, not once, not in any way that mattered, and that meant they had no idea what I was capable of when I stopped trying to fit into the version of me they were comfortable with. "I want to review all adjacent properties," I said finally, and he raised an eyebrow slightly, not questioning, just curious. "Adjacent," he repeated, and I nodded, sliding a printed map across the desk, the same one I had looked at the night before, except now it was marked, highlighted, structured in a way that made the pattern impossible to ignore. And as he leaned forward, scanning the layout, I watched his expression shift, just a fraction, just enough to tell me he was starting to understand. "These are all under your name," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and I confirmed it calmly. "Yes, all of them." And there was a brief silence after that, the kind that happens when someone recalibrates what they thought the situation was, because this was no longer a single property dispute, this was leverage. This was positioning, this was something much larger than what my parents believed they had taken. "Then this changes things," he said, and I could hear the difference now, the tone sharper, more focused. "If we establish a pattern, if we connect the transfer to a broader asset structure, we can apply pressure in multiple directions." And he did not need to explain further, I already understood, because this was not just about recovering what was lost, it was about shifting the entire balance of power, quietly, methodically, without ever raising my voice. Over the next few hours, we built the framework, timelines, ownership records, transaction histories, every piece aligned, every detail verified, and the more we worked, the clearer it became that my parents had made one critical mistake. They assumed the house was the center of my world, the single point of control, and because of that, they never looked beyond it, never questioned what else might exist just outside their line of sight, and that assumption, more than anything else, was what was going to cost them. I did not contact them that day, not because I was avoiding the conversation, but because there was nothing left to say that would change anything. They had already shown me exactly where they stood, and now it was my turn to decide where I stood, and that decision did not require words, it required action, precise, deliberate action. Late that afternoon, as I was leaving the office, the attorney handed me a copy of the initial filing documents, not yet submitted, but ready, waiting for my approval, and he said, "Once this is filed, there is no quiet way back from it," and I nodded, not needing the warning, because I was not looking for a quiet way back. I was looking for a clear path forward, one that did not depend on their approval, their acknowledgement, or their version of what was fair. And as I stepped outside into the cool air, the city moving around me like nothing had changed, I realized that for the first time since that phone call in the conference hallway, I was not reacting anymore. I was deciding, and that difference, small as it seemed, was everything. The next call came sooner than I expected, not from my father, not from my mother, but from Olivia, and that alone told me things were already shifting in ways they did not fully understand yet, because Olivia never called me unless there was something she needed or something had gone wrong, and when I saw her name on my phone that evening, I let it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to hear how she would start the conversation when she did not know how much I already knew. "Emily," she said, her voice softer than usual, almost careful, "what is going on?" And I leaned back in my chair, looking out over the city lights as if I had all the time in the world. "That depends," I replied. "What have they told you?" And there was a pause, a small one, but enough to confirm that whatever version of the story she had been given was incomplete. "They said you are overreacting," she said finally, "that it was just a financial decision and you agreed to the transfer," and I almost smiled, because that was exactly how they would frame it, reduce it, simplify it, remove any detail that made it uncomfortable, and present it as something reasonable, something justified. "Did they tell you they sold it while I was out of state?" I asked, and the silence on the other end stretched just a little longer this time. "No," she admitted, and I could hear the shift, the first crack in the version she had been given, and I did not push it. I did not explain further, because I had learned that people see more clearly when they are allowed to connect the pieces themselves. "Emily," she said again, her tone changing, "they needed the money. Things have not been stable, you know that," and there it was, the same justification, passed down, repeated, softened just enough to sound reasonable, and for a moment, I thought about explaining everything, about laying out the timeline, the documents, the decisions, but I stopped myself because none of that would matter right now, not to her, not yet. "I do know that," I said instead, "and I also know they did not think I would do anything about it," and that was the first moment she sounded uncertain. "What do you mean?" she asked, and I let a second pass before answering, just enough to make the words land. "I mean they assumed I would absorb it like always," and there was no response to that, because we both knew it was true. The conversation did not last much longer after that. She asked a few more questions, none of them direct enough to matter, and I answered just enough to confirm that this was not something I was going to let go, and when we hung up, I knew she would go back to them, repeat what I said, and for the first time, they would realize that I was not responding the way they expected, not arguing, not pleading, not negotiating, just moving forward without them. The next morning, I returned to the property, not to confront anyone, not to make a scene, but to see it clearly, to stand there and understand exactly what had been taken and what had not. The new owners were already moving in, boxes stacked near the front door, a moving truck parked along the curb, and for a moment, I watched from across the street, taking in the details, the way the sunlight hit the windows, the way the front steps looked exactly the same as the day I first walked up them. With the keys in my hand, and it would have been easy to focus on that, on what was no longer mine, but instead, I turned slightly, just enough to look past it, to the row of properties extending down the block, and beyond that the adjacent street, and the one after that, each one a piece of something larger that had never been part of their plan, and I felt that same calm settle in again, because perspective changes everything, and from where I was standing, this was no longer a loss, it was a starting point. Later that afternoon, the first official notice was sent, not to them directly, but to the parties involved in the transaction, structured, formal, precise, raising questions that required answers, not emotional ones, not personal ones, but legal ones, the kind that cannot be dismissed with a conversation at the dinner table, and I knew the moment they received it, everything would change, because up until now, this had been contained within the family, manageable, something they could control through narrative, but once it moved into a different space, one defined by documentation and accountability, their version would no longer be enough. I did not have to wait long to see the impact, because by early evening, my phone lit up again, this time with my father's name, and I let it ring once before answering, not to play a game, but to set the tone, and when I picked up, his voice was different, not calm, not controlled, but sharp, edged with something he was trying to keep in check. "What did you do?" he asked, no greeting, no preamble, just the question. And I could almost picture him standing in the same living room, where we had sat weeks earlier, the papers spread out on the table, the confidence he had then already starting to fracture, and I did not raise my voice. I did not match his tone. I simply said, I started reviewing what happened, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything he had said, because for the first time, he did not know what came next. He did not like that answer. I could hear it in the way he exhaled, sharp and controlled, like he was trying to contain something that had already started slipping. Reviewing, he repeated, slower this time, "Emily, do not make this bigger than it needs to be," and I almost appreciated the phrasing, because it revealed exactly how he still saw the situation, something small, something manageable. Something that could be minimized if he just applied enough pressure, the same strategy he had used my entire life: reduce, redirect, resolve, except this time, I was not playing the same role in that pattern. "It is already bigger than you think," I said, not raising my voice, not adding emphasis, just stating it as a fact, and that was when his tone shifted again, less controlled now, more direct. "You signed the transfer," he said, "you knew what it meant," and there it was, the foundation of his argument. The assumption that a signature erased everything that came before it, the context, the trust, the conversation that led to it, and for a moment, I let the silence sit between us, not as hesitation, but as space for the truth to settle. "I knew what you told me it meant," I replied, and the difference between those two sentences was everything. He did not respond immediately, and in that pause, I could almost hear him recalculating, adjusting his approach, because this was no longer the version of me he was used to, the one who would soften her words to keep the peace, the one who would accept his framing just to end the conversation. "Look," he said finally, his voice dropping into something that sounded almost reasonable, almost conciliatory, "we can work something out, there is no need to involve other people in this," and that was the first time he acknowledged it, not directly, not by naming it, but by trying to contain it, and I knew exactly what he meant by other people: the buyers, the agents, the attorneys, the ones who operated outside the family dynamic, the ones who would not accept his version without documentation to support it, and I could not help but notice how quickly his position had shifted from certainty to negotiation, and we were not even a full day into the process. "It is already involved," I said, and I kept my tone the same, even, measured, because the moment I matched his urgency, I would lose the advantage, and he knew it. I could hear it in the way he tightened his words. "Then stop it," he said, more forcefully now, "before this gets out of control." And I almost asked him what he thought control looked like in this situation, because from where I was standing, control had already changed hands. But instead, I said something simpler, something that did not invite debate. "That is not how this works anymore," and that was when the conversation ended, not with a resolution, not with an agreement, but with a realization on his side that he could no longer direct the outcome the way he always had. After the call, I did not feel satisfaction, not in the way people expect when something starts to turn in their favor. There was no rush, no sense of victory, just that same quiet clarity, because this was not about winning an argument, it was about correcting a structure that had been tilted in one direction for too long, and that kind of shift does not happen in a single moment, it happens in stages, each one building on the last. By the following day, the responses began to come in, formal, cautious, written in the careful language people use when they realize a situation might not be as simple as they first believed, requests for clarification, acknowledgments of receipt, notices that certain actions would be paused pending review, and each one confirmed what I already knew: the process was working, not loudly, not dramatically, but effectively, and more importantly, it was moving beyond the boundaries my parents had relied on to maintain control. I spent most of that afternoon with the attorney again, going through the next steps, not rushing, not skipping ahead, just building the case layer by layer, because the goal was not just to challenge the sale, it was to establish a pattern, to show how the transfer, the timing, and the execution all connected. And as we worked, he asked a question that most people would have asked much earlier: "Why did you not tell them about the other properties?" And I considered that for a moment, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted to phrase it in a way that was accurate. Because every time I showed them something I built, I said, "It stopped being mine," and he nodded once, not surprised, not judgmental, just understanding, and that was enough. Later that evening, as I was reviewing the documents again on my own, my phone buzzed with a message, not a call this time, just a short text from my mother: "We need to talk." No greeting, no context, just that one line: and I looked at it for a few seconds before setting the phone down without responding, because I already knew what that conversation would be, not an acknowledgement, not an apology, but an attempt to regain some version of control, to reframe the situation in a way that made it manageable again, and I was no longer interested in that version of the story, not when the real one was finally starting to take shape. I did not respond to my mother that night, and I did not respond the next morning either, not because I was avoiding her, but because I understood something she did not. Timing matters more than words, and if I answered too early, I would be stepping back into a conversation where they still believed they could shape the outcome, so I let the message sit, unread in her mind, even though I had already seen it, and instead, I focused on the next step, the one that would move this further away from anything they could manage with a phone call or a family discussion. By mid-morning, the second wave of notices had gone out, more detailed this time, outlining specific concerns about the transaction, requesting documentation, highlighting inconsistencies in timing and authorization, and each one was directed not just at my parents but at every party connected to the sale, because accountability does not exist in isolation, it expands outward, and the more people who are required to respond, the harder it becomes to contain the narrative. Around noon, my phone rang again, and this time, when I saw my mother's name, I answered, not because I felt ready, but because I knew she would not stop until she got a response, and when I picked up, her voice was already tight, controlled in that familiar way she used when she was trying to sound calm but could not quite hide the urgency underneath. "Emily, what is happening?" she asked, skipping any pretense of casual conversation, and I could hear movement in the background, voices, not clear enough to distinguish, but enough to tell me I was not the only one listening. "You already know what is happening," I said, and I kept my tone neutral, because the moment I allowed emotion into this, it would give her something to work with, something to redirect, and she moved quickly, as she always did. "We received some kind of notice this morning," she said, legal language, requests for information, "this is unnecessary. We can handle this ourselves," and there it was again, the attempt to pull it back into their space, into something they could define and control, and I let her finish before responding, because she needed to say it, she needed to believe it was still an option. "It is not unnecessary," I said, "it is appropriate," and there was a brief silence after that, the kind that follows when someone realizes the conversation is not going to follow the path they expected. "Emily," she said, her voice softer now, shifting tactics, "this is your family, you do not take family matters outside like this," and for a moment, I almost recognized the old pull in those words, the way they used to work on me, the way they framed everything as loyalty, as obligation, but that version of me was no longer part of this situation. It stopped being a family matter when you sold the property, I replied, and I did not raise my voice, I did not emphasize the words, I just stated them, and that was enough. She did not respond immediately, and when she did, the softness was gone, replaced by something sharper, more direct. "You signed the documents," she said, echoing my father's argument from the day before, "you cannot act like you had no part in this," and I could hear the frustration now, the edges of control slipping, and I understood why, because this was the first time they were being forced to operate outside the system they had built, the one where my compliance filled in the gaps they created. "I had a part in the transfer," I said, "not in the sale," and that distinction mattered, not just legally, but structurally, and I knew she could hear it, even if she did not want to acknowledge it. "What do you want?" she asked then, more directly, and for a second, I considered answering in a way she would understand, something simple, something immediate, but I chose not to, because what I wanted was not a single outcome, it was a correction, something that could not be reduced to a number or a quick agreement. "I want the process to run," I said instead, and that was when her voice changed again, not softer, not sharper, but uncertain, just enough to reveal that she did not fully understand what that meant, and that was the point. The call ended not long after that, not with resolution, but with a shift, because now they knew this was not something they could talk their way out of, and more importantly, they knew I was not going to meet them halfway just to restore the appearance of normal. That afternoon, I returned to the attorney's office for a final review before the formal filing, and as we went through the documents, he pointed out something that had not been clear before, the way the timeline intersected with other transactions in the area, the way certain decisions aligned in a pattern that suggested more than just a single isolated action, and as he explained it, I realized something I had not considered fully until that moment. This was not just about what they took, it was about how they took it, and how that method could be examined, questioned, and ultimately challenged in a way that extended beyond one property, and that changed everything. Once this is filed, he said again, repeating the warning from the day before, it will move quickly, and I nodded, not because I was impatient, but because I understood that speed, in this context, did not mean chaos, it meant momentum, and momentum, once established, is very difficult to stop. As I signed the final authorization, the pen moving across the paper with a steadiness I would not have had even a week earlier, I felt that same clarity settle in again, not as a reaction, not as a defense, but as a position, one that did not depend on their acknowledgement, their agreement, or their version of events, and as I handed the documents back, I knew that whatever happened next would no longer be defined by what they took, but by what they failed to see. The filing went through at 10:42 the next morning, and nothing visible happened at first, no immediate reaction, no dramatic shift, just a quiet confirmation email and a case number, a single line of text that most people would overlook, but I knew better, because that was the moment everything became formal, documented, and no longer something that could be redirected with a conversation or softened with a familiar tone, and by noon, the responses began again, different this time, not cautious. Not neutral but urgent, requests marked as high priority, language tightening, timeline shortening, because once a process like this starts, it forces everyone involved to move, whether they want to or not. I did not reach out to my parents, I did not need to, because the system was already doing that for me, and by early afternoon, my phone rang again, my father this time, and when I answered, his voice had changed in a way I had never heard before, not louder, not angrier, but strained, like he was holding onto something that was slipping faster than he could manage. "Emily, what did you file?" he asked. And I could hear papers moving in the background, voices overlapping, the controlled environment he was used to starting to fracture under pressure, and I did not rush my response. I let a second pass, then another, because silence has a way of making the truth heavier. I filed a review of the transaction, I said, keeping it simple, keeping it accurate, and that was enough to set him off balance, because he had expected something more emotional, more reactive, something he could counter directly, and instead, he was facing something structured, something he could not interrupt. "You need to withdraw it," he said quickly, almost immediately, the words coming faster now. "This is escalating beyond what you understand," and I almost asked him if he realized how that sounded, because for the first time, he was the one outside of the situation, the one trying to catch up, but I did not. I just said, "I understand it exactly," and there was a pause, a sharp one, followed by a lower tone. One I had heard before but never directed at me in this way. "This will affect more than just that house," he said. "There are other things connected to it," and there it was, the first real indication that what we were uncovering was already reaching beyond the original transaction, and I felt that same calm settle in again, because this was no longer just about what they had done, it was about everything attached to it, everything they had assumed would remain untouched. "Then it should be reviewed," I replied, and I could hear the shift on the other end, the moment he realized that the usual pressure points were not working, that the language he had relied on for years no longer had the same effect. "Emily," he said again, slower now, more deliberate, "we can fix this, we can compensate you, whatever the value is, we can make it right." And that was the first time he framed it in terms of value, not control, not justification, but compensation, and that told me everything I needed to know, because it meant he was starting to see the risk in terms he could not ignore. I looked out the window as he spoke, watching the street below, people moving through their day like nothing had changed, and I thought about how easily this could have gone differently, how a single conversation, a single acknowledgement, might have shifted everything before it reached this point, but that moment had passed, and what remained was something much more defined, much less flexible. "It is not about the number," I said, and I kept my voice even, not dismissive, not emotional, just clear. "It is about how it was done," and for a second, there was nothing on the other end, no response, no interruption, just silence, because that was not something he could negotiate around. The call ended shortly after that, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a kind of unfinished tension that did not need words to be understood, and as I set the phone down, I knew this was the point where everything would start to accelerate, not in a chaotic way but in a structured, unavoidable sequence, because once multiple parties are involved, once documentation is being reviewed from different angles, the situation stops being contained, it becomes something that moves on its own. By late afternoon, the attorney called me with an update, his tone focused, efficient. "We have received preliminary responses," he said, "and there are discrepancies," and I could hear it in the way he emphasized that word, not casually, not as a possibility, but as something concrete, and he began outlining them, small at first, inconsistencies in dates, variations in how certain documents were presented, But as he continued, the pattern became clearer. These were not isolated errors, they were connected, layered, reinforcing each other in a way that suggested the process had not been as straightforward as it appeared on the surface. And as he spoke, I realized something that shifted everything again. This was not just about recovering what was mine, it was about exposing a structure that had been built on assumptions, on shortcuts, on the belief that no one would ever look closely enough to question it. "We will proceed to the next phase," he said finally, and I asked the only question that mattered at that point, "How long?" And there was a brief pause before he answered, "Not long," and something in the way he said it made it clear that this was no longer just a possibility, it was already unfolding, and as I ended the call, I understood that whatever came next would not be something they could stop, only something they would have to face. The next update did not come as a phone call, it came as a forwarded document, a dense block of text from the attorney that I opened late that evening, and as I read through it, line by line, I could feel the shape of everything becoming more defined, not louder, not more dramatic, just clearer, because clarity has a way of removing any illusion left in a situation, and what was left now was not a misunderstanding, not a disagreement, but a sequence of actions that could be examined from multiple angles, and none of those angles worked in their favor. The discrepancies he mentioned earlier were not just technical, they were structural, inconsistencies in how ownership was represented at different stages, timing gaps that did not align with standard processing windows, and most importantly, documentation that suggested decisions had been made under conditions that were not fully disclosed, and as I reached the end of the report, there was a single sentence that stood out, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. "This transaction may be subject to challenge based on misrepresentation and procedural irregularities," and I read it twice, not to understand it, but to let it settle, because that sentence was the beginning of something they would not be able to control. I closed the file and sat there for a moment, the room quiet except for the low hum of the city outside, and I realized that for the first time since all of this started, I was not thinking about what they did, I was thinking about what they assumed, the belief that I would not look closely, that I would not question the details, that I would not take the time to understand the structure of what they had put in place, and that assumption, more than anything else, was what had allowed this to happen, and now it was the exact thing that was working against them. The following morning, I met with the attorney again, this time to go over the next phase in detail, and as we sat across from each other, the same glass wall behind him reflecting a city that continued to move as if nothing had changed, he outlined the process, not in broad terms, but step by step, what would be requested, how responses would be evaluated, where pressure points might emerge, and how those points could be used to guide the outcome, and as he spoke, I noticed something different. In his tone, not urgency, not excitement, but certainty, the kind that comes from seeing a pattern clearly enough to predict where it leads. "They are already responding defensively," he said, referencing the latest communication we had received, "and that usually means they are aware of the exposure," and I nodded, because that matched what I had heard in my father's voice, the shift from control to containment, the attempt to limit the scope of what was being examined. But once a process like this expands, once multiple elements are connected, it does not contract easily. "What happens next?" I asked, and he leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk. "We request full disclosure," he said, "not just for the sale, but for anything related to it, financial movements, prior agreements, any documentation that intersects with this transaction," and I understood immediately, this was no longer about a single point, it was about the network around it, and networks, once examined, tend to reveal more than the original issue. That afternoon, the formal request was sent, broader than the previous notices, more detailed, and impossible to ignore, and I knew that when they received it, they would understand what was happening, not just in terms of the house, but in terms of everything connected to it, and that realization would come with a kind of pressure they were not used to managing, because for the first time, they were not controlling the flow of information, they were responding to it. It did not take long for that pressure to surface, because by early evening, Olivia called again, and this time, there was no attempt to soften the conversation, no careful tone, just direct concern. "What is going on, Emily?" she asked, her voice tighter than before. "They are asking for everything, financial records, agreements, things I did not even know existed," and I could hear the difference now, not just uncertainty, but unease, because this was moving beyond something she could dismiss as a misunderstanding. "They are reviewing the situation," I said, keeping my response consistent, because consistency creates its own kind of clarity, and she exhaled a quick, uneven breath. "This is getting serious," she said, and I let that sit for a moment before replying. "It has been serious from the beginning, and there was silence after that, not because she disagreed, but because she was starting to see it from a different angle, one that did not center on what they needed but on what they had done. "You should talk to them," she said after a moment. "This can still be worked out," and I almost asked her what she thought worked out meant now, because the structure had already shifted, the process was already in motion, but instead, I said something simpler, something that did not invite negotiation. "I'm handling it," and that was when the call ended, not abruptly, but with a kind of quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be resolved in a conversation between us. Later that night, as I reviewed the updated timeline the attorney had sent over, I noticed something that had not been obvious before, a point where multiple elements intersected, the transfer, the sale, and another transaction in the surrounding area, all aligning within a narrow window, and I leaned back in my chair, looking at the screen, and realized that this was the piece that would change everything, not because it was dramatic, but because it connected what had seemed separate, and once those connections were made clear, the situation would no longer be something they could explain away, it would be something they would have to answer for. The moment I saw that intersection on the timeline, I knew this was no longer just about a single decision they made in a moment of pressure, it was about a sequence, something planned, structured, and executed with the assumption that no one would ever take the time to connect the pieces, and I stared at the screen for a few seconds longer than I needed to, not because I was confused, but because I understood exactly what it meant once it was laid out clearly, the transfer of my property, the timing of the sale, and the adjacent transaction that followed within days, all linked not by coincidence, but by intent, and that realization did not come with anger, it came with a kind of quiet confirmation, the kind that removes any remaining doubt about what you are dealing with. I forwarded the timeline back to the attorney with a single note, asking him to verify the connection, and his response came faster than usual, which told me everything I needed to know before I even opened it. "We are seeing the same pattern," he wrote, followed by a breakdown that aligned with what I had already started to understand. The sale of my property had not just been about immediate liquidity, it had been positioned within a broader movement of assets, one that depended on timing, on control, and on the assumption that I would not interfere, and now that I had, the entire structure was being forced into the open. That afternoon, the next set of communications went out, not just requests anymore, but formal inquiries tied directly to that pattern, asking for explanations that could not be answered with general statements or familiar justifications, and I knew that when those landed, the shift would become undeniable, because this was no longer about what happened, it was about why it happened in the way that it did. I did not have to wait long to see the impact, because my father called again, and this time, when I answered, there was no attempt to control the tone, no effort to sound calm, just a direct question: "Where are you getting this information?" And I leaned back slightly, letting the silence settle before I responded, because that question revealed more than anything he had said before. It meant he understood that the situation had moved beyond what he could manage internally. "It is all in the records," I said, and that was the truth, simple, unavoidable, and he exhaled sharply, not in anger, but in frustration, the kind that comes when someone realizes they are no longer the only one who understands the full picture. "You are misinterpreting it," he said quickly, almost immediately. "Those transactions are separate," and I could hear the effort in his voice, the attempt to separate what had already been connected, to create distance where there was none, and I did not argue. I did not try to convince him, because this was not a conversation that would be resolved through explanation. "Then that will be clarified," I replied, and I kept my tone even, because the process would do that work, not me. There was a pause after that, longer than any before, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured, but with something underneath it that had not been there before, something closer to concern. "Emily, you are creating a situation that will affect everyone," he said, and I recognized that shift immediately, the move from defending the action to warning about the consequences, and I understood why. Because once patterns are exposed, they do not just affect one point, they extend outward, touching everything connected to them. And that was something he had not planned for. "I did not create it," I said, and I let that sit, not as an argument, but as a fact, and there was nothing he could say to that, because we both knew where it started. The call ended shortly after, not because there was nothing left to say, but because there was nothing left that would change anything, and as I set the phone down, I realized that this was the moment where everything shifted from reaction to inevitability, not in a dramatic sense but in a structural one, because once the right questions are asked in the right way, the answers begin to align whether people want them to or not. Later that evening, the attorney called with an update that confirmed what I had already started to see. "We have received partial disclosures," he said, and they support the connection, and he began outlining the details, how certain funds moved within a narrow window, how the sale of my property fit into a sequence that made sense only when viewed as part of a larger plan, and as he spoke, I felt that same steady clarity settle in again, because this was no longer about uncovering possibilities, it was about confirming realities. What does that mean for the case? I asked, and he did not hesitate. It strengthens it, he said, significantly, and there was a brief pause before he added, it also expands it, and that was the part that mattered most, because expansion meant more visibility, more scrutiny, more points of pressure, and less room for anything to remain hidden. After the call, I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet for a moment, not thinking about what would happen next, but about how we got here, how something that started as a single decision had unfolded into something much larger, something that could no longer be contained within the boundaries they had relied on for years, and I realized that the most important part of all of this was not the property, not the money, not even the outcome, it was the fact that for the first time, everything was being seen clearly, without filters, without assumptions, without the familiar narrative that had always been used to justify what they did, and once something is seen that clearly, it cannot be unseen, not by them, not by anyone involved, and that was what would carry this forward. The expansion of the case did not happen all at once, it unfolded in layers, each one revealing something that made the previous layer impossible to ignore, and by the time the next set of documents arrived, the situation had already moved beyond anything my parents could reframe or contain, because now it was not just about inconsistencies, it was about alignment, the kind that only appears when multiple actions are part of the same intent, and as I reviewed the latest disclosures, I could see it more clearly than ever. The sequence was not random, it was structured, each step dependent on the one before it, and my property had been positioned right at the center of that sequence, not because it was convenient, but because it was necessary. I met with the attorney again that morning, the same office, the same quiet atmosphere, but the tone had shifted, not tense, not uncertain, but focused in a way that suggested we were no longer searching for answers, we were confirming them, and as he laid out the updated timeline, connecting the newly disclosed information to what we already had, he paused at one point and tapped the page lightly. This is where it converges, he said, indicating the narrow window where everything aligned, the transfer, the sale, and the subsequent movement of funds, all occurring within a timeframe that left little room for coincidence, and I leaned forward slightly, not because I needed to see it more clearly, but because I understood what that convergence meant. It was the point where intent became visible. What does this allow us to do? I asked, and he did not hesitate. It allows us to challenge not just the outcome, but the process, he said, and there was a difference in the way he said it, not theoretical, not conditional, but definitive, and that was the moment I realized how far this had already moved from where it started. This was no longer about reversing a sale. It was about examining the structure that made that sale possible, and once that structure was questioned, everything connected to it would be subject to the same scrutiny. By early afternoon, the next phase began, formal notices expanding the scope of the review, not in a way that felt aggressive but in a way that was precise, targeted, and impossible to ignore, and I knew that when those notices were received, the shift would become undeniable, because this was no longer something that could be addressed with a single response, it required explanation across multiple points, each one reinforcing the next. It did not take long for that pressure to surface again, because my mother called shortly after, and this time, there was no attempt to control the conversation, no effort to soften the tone, just a direct urgency that cut through everything else. Emily, what are you doing? She asked, and I could hear the strain in her voice now, the difference between someone managing a situation and someone reacting to it, and I did not answer immediately, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the moment to settle, to let her hear the silence before the response. I am continuing the process, I said, and that was enough to shift the tone again, sharper this time, more direct. This is going too far, she said, you are affecting things you do not understand, and I almost repeated my father's words back to her because the similarity was too exact to ignore, but instead, I said something simpler, then it will be explained. And there was a pause after that, not brief, not uncertain, but heavy, because for the first time, she did not have a way to redirect the conversation, no familiar argument, no emotional leverage that would change the direction this was moving in. We can fix this, she said finally, echoing what my father had already tried. We can make arrangements, we can resolve it privately, and I could hear the shift now, from control to negotiation, from assumption to reaction, and I understood why, because once something becomes visible to multiple parties, privacy is no longer a shield, it is just a preference, and preferences do not hold up under scrutiny. It is already being reviewed, I said, and I kept my tone consistent, because consistency removes any space for misinterpretation, and that was when her voice changed again, not sharper, not softer, but quieter, almost uncertain. Why are you doing this? She asked, and for a moment I considered answering in a way that explained everything, the history, the pattern, the assumptions that led to this point, but I realized that none of that would matter in this moment, because this was not about understanding, it was about accountability, and those are two very different things, because it needs to be done, I said, and that was the end of it. After the call, I sat for a moment, not thinking about what she said, but about what she did not say. There was no denial of what happened, no attempt to argue the facts, just a focus on stopping the process, and that told me everything I needed to know about where this was heading, because when people stop defending their actions and start trying to contain the response, it means they understand the position they are in, even if they do not say it out loud. Later that evening, the attorney called with the next update, and his tone confirmed what I had already started to see. We are moving into a stronger position, he said, and he outlined the implications, how the convergence point we identified was now central to the review, how the pattern was becoming clearer with each additional disclosure, and how that clarity was limiting the range of possible explanations, and as he spoke, I felt that same steady sense of direction settle in again. Because this was no longer uncertain, it was unfolding exactly as it needed to, step by step, each phase building on the last. What is the next step? I asked, and there was a brief pause before he answered, we prepare for formal challenge, and that was the moment everything shifted again, not because it was unexpected, but because it marked the transition from review to action, from analysis to outcome, and as I ended the call, I understood that whatever happened next would not just define this situation, it would define everything connected to it, and for the first time, that did not feel overwhelming, it felt precise. The preparation for the formal challenge did not feel dramatic, it felt exact, every document reviewed, every detail aligned, every point connected in a way that made the next step not just possible, but necessary. And as I sat across from the attorney that morning, the folder in front of him thicker than it had been at any point before, I realized that what we were building was not just a case. It was a complete picture, one that did not rely on interpretation or assumption but on structure, on sequence, on the kind of clarity that leaves very little room for anything else. Once this is filed, he said, his tone steady, controlled, the response will not be optional, and I understood exactly what he meant, because up until now, everything had allowed for delay, for partial answers, for attempts to redirect, but this next step would remove that flexibility, it would require direct engagement, and that was something my parents were not used to facing without control over the terms. I signed the final documents without hesitation, not because I was eager to escalate, but because I knew that not moving forward would mean allowing everything that had already been uncovered to remain unresolved, and that was no longer an option. The filing went through that afternoon, and just like before, there was no immediate reaction, no visible shift, just confirmation, quiet and precise, but this time, I knew the difference. This was not the beginning of a process, it was the transition into something that would produce outcomes. By early evening, the first response came in, not from my parents, but from one of the external parties involved in the transaction, and the tone was completely different from anything before, formal, structured, and clearly aware of the implications, acknowledging the request, outlining their position, and more importantly, distancing themselves from certain aspects of the decision-making process, and as I read through it, I could see the pattern continuing, each party beginning to define their role, to separate themselves from the points of concern, and that separation, while subtle, was exactly what would bring everything into focus, because once roles are clarified, responsibility becomes much harder to shift. My father called not long after that, and this time, there was no attempt to control the conversation, no effort to frame it in a way that minimized what was happening, just a direct, unfiltered question. What do you want from this? And I let the silence sit for a moment before answering, not because I needed time, but because I wanted him to hear the absence of anything he could immediately respond to. I wanted addressed, I said, and that was the truth, simple, clear, and not something that could be negotiated down to a number, or an agreement behind closed doors. It is being addressed, he said quickly, almost defensively. We are responding, we are cooperating, and I could hear the shift now, from control to compliance, from directing the situation to reacting within it, and that shift, more than anything else, confirmed how much had changed in a very short amount of time. That is good, I replied, and I kept my tone neutral, because this was no longer about convincing him of anything, it was about allowing the process to do what it was designed to do. There was a pause after that, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured, but carrying something underneath it that had not been there before, something closer to realization. This is going to affect everything, he said, and I understood exactly what he meant because by now the connections were clear, the pattern established, and the scope of what was being examined had expanded beyond what he had originally planned for. Then it should be correct, I said, and I did not add anything else, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. The call ended shortly after, not with resolution, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement that whatever came next would not be shaped by conversation, but by outcome. Later that night, as I reviewed the latest updates, I noticed something that had not been visible before, not in the documents, not in the timeline, but in the overall direction of everything, the way each response was narrowing the range of possible explanations, the way each clarification was reinforcing the same conclusion, and I realized that this was the point where everything began to converge, not just the facts, but the understanding of them, across all parties involved. The attorney called shortly after with the same observation, his tone steady, but with a clarity that had not been there at the beginning. We are approaching resolution, he said, and there was a brief pause before he added, the structure is clear, and I knew exactly what he meant because once the structure is clear, the outcome is no longer uncertain, it is just a matter of time. As I ended the call, I sat for a moment in the quiet, not thinking about what they would say next, not anticipating their response, but recognizing something that had been building from the very beginning. This was never just about what they took, it was about what they failed to see, and now, finally, everything they had overlooked was the very thing defining what came next. The shift into resolution did not arrive with a single moment, it unfolded in a way that was almost quiet, almost understated, but impossible to ignore once it began, because everything that had been building finally started to align into something definitive, and by the time the next update came in, there was no ambiguity left in the structure we had uncovered, only the outcome that followed from it. I was back in the attorney's office when he received the latest response, and I watched as he read through it, his expression unchanged, focused, but when he finished, he set the document down with a level of certainty that had not been present at the beginning. They are conceding key points, he said, and that sentence carried more weight than anything else he could have added, because it meant the pattern we had identified was no longer being challenged, it was being acknowledged, even if indirectly. He walked me through it step by step, the language careful, measured, but clear, admissions that certain aspects of the process had not followed standard procedures, acknowledgments that timing decisions were influenced by factors not previously disclosed, and most importantly, a shift in tone that moved away from justification and toward resolution, and as he explained it, I realized that this was the moment where everything changed, not because of what was said, but because of what was no longer being denied. What does this mean for the outcome? I asked, and he did not hesitate. It means we have leverage, he said, and more importantly, it means they know it, and that distinction mattered, because leverage without awareness is potential, but leverage with awareness becomes pressure, and pressure, once established, leads to movement. By the end of that meeting, the framework for resolution was already forming, not as a negotiation in the traditional sense, but as a structured response to the position they had put themselves in, options being outlined, consequences being defined, and timelines being set in a way that did not allow for delay or redirection, and I could see how each piece fit together, how the process we had initiated was now guiding the outcome in a way that no individual conversation could have achieved. That afternoon, the first formal proposal came through, and as I read it, I could see the shift clearly. It was no longer framed around defending the original action, it was focused on addressing it, acknowledging the irregularities, proposing corrective measures, and outlining a path forward that, while not an admission in the way most people would expect, functioned as one in every way that mattered. And I sat there for a moment, reading through it again, not because I needed to understand it, but because I recognized what it represented, the point where control had fully shifted, not through confrontation, not through escalation, but through structure, through clarity, through the accumulation of details that could not be ignored. My father called later that evening, and when I answered, his voice was different in a way that was difficult to describe, not strained, not defensive, but measured, as if he had finally adjusted to the reality of the situation. We received the proposal, he said, and I could hear the weight of that sentence, not in the words themselves, but in what they implied, that he was no longer trying to stop the process, he was responding within it. So did I replied, keeping my tone even, because this was no longer about reaction, it was about position, and there was a brief pause before he continued, this does not need to go further, he said, and I recognized the shift immediately, not a command, not a demand, but a suggestion, an acknowledgement that the direction was no longer his to control. That depends on how it is addressed, I said, and I left it at that, because the outcome would be determined by actions, not words, and for the first time in this entire process, he did not try to redirect, he did not argue, he simply said, "We are working on it," and that was the end of the call. Later that night, I reviewed the proposal again, this time with the full context of everything that had led to it, and I could see how each part connected back to the pattern we had uncovered, how each concession aligned with the discrepancies we had identified, and how the entire structure of the response was shaped by the same clarity that had driven the process from the beginning. And I realized that this was what resolution actually looked like, not a dramatic reversal. Not a sudden change, but a steady, deliberate correction of everything that had been put in place under the assumption that it would never be questioned. The attorney called one last time that evening, his tone calm, but with a finality that made it clear we had reached the point we had been building toward. "We are in a strong position," he said, "the outcome will reflect that," and there was a brief pause before he added, "This will conclude soon," and as I ended the call, I sat in the quiet for a moment, not thinking about what had been taken, not even about what would be returned, but about the process itself, the way it had unfolded, the way each step had revealed something that had been hidden in plain sight. And I understood something then that had not been clear at the beginning. This was never just about a property, it was about visibility, about bringing something into the open that had always relied on being unseen, and now that it was visible, there was only one direction left for it to go. The final agreement was signed on a quiet afternoon, not in a courtroom, not in a room filled with tension, but in the same office where everything had slowly, deliberately come into focus, and as I placed the pen down after the last signature, there was no dramatic shift, no overwhelming sense of victory, just a calm, steady understanding that everything had reached its natural conclusion, exactly the way it was supposed to. And across from me, the attorney closed the folder with a soft click. The same sound I had heard at the very beginning, except now it carried a completely different weight, not uncertainty, not anticipation, but completion. The terms were clear, structured in a way that reflected everything that had been uncovered, the property transaction formally reversed, ownership restored, financial adjustments made to account for what had been done, and additional provisions put in place to ensure that nothing like this could be repeated, not quietly, not under the same assumptions, and as I reviewed the final document one last time, I realized that the outcome was not just about getting something back, it was about correcting something that had been allowed to exist for far too long, a pattern that depended on silence, on compliance, on the belief that it would never be challenged. My parents were not in the room when it was finalized, and that felt appropriate, because this was never about a confrontation, it was about a shift, something that had already happened long before this moment, something that could not be undone by a conversation or a gesture, and when I stepped outside afterward, the air felt the same, the city moved the same, nothing around me had changed, and yet everything had, because for the first time, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was standing in a position I had built myself, one that did not depend on anyone else's approval or recognition. I drove past the property later that evening, not to revisit what had happened, but to see it clearly, without the weight of everything that had come before, and the house looked exactly the same as it always had, the same front steps, the same windows catching the last light of the day, but it no longer felt like the center of anything, just one part of something much larger, something I had built quietly, piece by piece, without needing anyone else to see it until it mattered. I did not call my parents and they did not call me, not that night, not the next day, and that silence was not empty, it was defined, shaped by everything that had been said and everything that had been proven, and for the first time, it did not feel like something I needed to fill, it felt like something that could exist without changing what I had already established. In the days that followed, everything settled into place, the documents finalized, the records updated, the structure corrected, and as each piece fell into alignment, I found myself thinking less about what had happened and more about what it meant, not just for me, but for everything that had led to it, because this was never just about a property, it was about a relationship defined by imbalance, by assumptions that one person would always give more, accept more, absorb more, and what happens when that pattern is finally interrupted. The truth is, situations like this do not begin with a single decision, they begin with small moments, repeated over time, where one person is asked to step back, to compromise, to be the one who understands. Until eventually, that role becomes expected, and expectation turns into entitlement, and entitlement turns into action without question, and by the time it reaches something visible, something undeniable, the pattern has already been in place for years, quietly shaping everything around it. What changes everything is not a single confrontation, it is clarity, the moment when someone sees the pattern for what it is and decides not to continue it, not loudly, not with anger, but with precision, with structure, with a refusal to participate in something that no longer aligns with what is right, and that kind of clarity does not just change outcomes, it changes relationships, because it forces everything into the open, where it can no longer rely on assumption or silence to survive. And maybe that is the part that matters most, not the resolution itself, not what was returned or corrected, but the understanding that comes with it, the recognition that real connection, real family, cannot be built on imbalance, on one person carrying more than they should while the other takes without question, because that is not support, that is not care, that is something else entirely, something that will eventually break under its own weight, no matter how long it is ignored. What holds people together is not obligation, it is respect, it is awareness, it is the willingness to see each other clearly, without minimizing, without assuming, without taking what is not freely given, and when that exists, there is no need for correction, no need for processes like the one I went through, because nothing is hidden, nothing is taken without understanding, and nothing is built on the idea that one person will always be the one to give more. That is what I understood in the end, not just about them, but about myself, that strength is not in how much you can endure, it is in knowing when to stop enduring, when to stand in what you have built and allow it to define the terms moving forward, and that is not something anyone can take from you, not if you see it clearly enough to protect it.